Hello, everybody. Welcome to my channel, East West Leadership. And I would like to welcome very, very warmly today Aarti Kelshikar, who is, I think, one of my friends and also a fellow author. And we are going to talk about, or at least we are going to use as a trigger to have a conversation, her book. And she's going to introduce it more, but it's called How Women Work. As you can see, it is a conversation starter. This is what my copy looks like. All of these little pieces of paper are places that I wish I could ask you about, but we only have about half an hour to talk to each other. So I think even before we start talking, I recommend that everybody dives into the book and we will hear more about it. One thing that many people know if they follow my channel is that I hate introducing people because not only the name, but I also don't want to prioritize something based on my own taste. So could you please just briefly introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, where you are, and what brought you to this book?
Thank you. So, firstly, it's great to be here, Gabor. Thank you. And, we have so many synergies in common. We're both authors, as you mentioned. So, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me. Um, okay, so in terms of a very brief introduction, I am an intercultural coach. I've been one since 2008. Before that, I worked in the area of regulatory compliance, and I made the shift into culture in 2008 when we were living in the Philippines. Um, I work across the spectrum of diversity. And what led me to write this book was my first book, which is called How India Works, which was really about, kind of outlining the cultural nuances and complexities, and there's several that India has. So that was the first book. And then I used a similar cultural lens to look at how women work while we were in Singapore. And this book really looks at um, leadership, gender, and culture across Asia. But when we say Asia, it's so vast. So I had to kind of distill it into a couple of countries. So I've covered 6 different countries and talked about how women have navigated, some of the cultural aspects and what do they do well and what are some lessons and learnings for all of us.
Hmm.
So I think the way I would describe myself is a coach, a trainer, a facilitator, and an author.
All right. So first of all, what the book does brilliantly, what is something I think we are fellow spirits here, what I also try to do in Dragon Suit is that it really takes the person and puts you in front of that person. So it really, really sounds like a conversation. You really feel like you are in a story. And your book is a fascinating journey because, of course, it throws you all across the continent, which is a big continent. And we are in India, we are in China, we are in Japan. We are not in Japan, but we are talking to a Japanese leader, foreign leaders in the countries, local leaders in that relevant country. So it is a wild ride. And also the characters. I don't know, maybe you can tell me more about it later on it. Is it intentional that the character of the leaders that you interview, that you give voice to, are so completely different? One of them is this kind of iron lady who is challenging the world of man in leadership. The other one is more like a mother figure who is bringing those values into leadership. But before we go there, what I would like to ask you is, here is an interesting thing. Big print, How Women Work. And then subtitle, Fitting in and Standing Out in Asia, which makes me wonder how specific all these challenges and these triumphs and best practices are to Asia. And did you write a book about female leaders and then you realized, let's give it an Asia spin? Or did you write a book about Asian female leaders and then realize how universal this message is?
Yeah, okay. I think a bit of both. I do think that, many of the challenges that women face across the world are universal. Yeah. But that said, I think they're certainly prevalent in Asia. And I don't think I'm an expert to talk of, the West, just to put it in one word. But I'm Asian and I know of, firsthand of some of the challenges, some of the positives that women in this part of the world experience and encounter. And having lived in India, Singapore, and the Philippines, I'm fairly familiar with that. So, which is why I did want to talk about Asia right from the get go. Yeah. And as I said, I wanted it to be not all of Asia, because that's not possible to do. It's so vast, but I kind of, distilled it in 6 different countries that I thought I could do justice to, right? So it is about Asia right from the get-go. Having said that, I do think, a lot of it is can be replicated or is common across other places. But for the moment, I think let's just stick to Asia, right? Because that's really vast as well. And the reason I wrote it is because, I came across books that, you have Sheryl Sandberg, you have Melinda Gates, you have a lot of Western authors who write about Asian women. But I didn't really see Asian authors writing about Asian women. And
Right.
I thought, yeah. And I
And the
mean, you
reason why
see,
that is, not enough Asian leaders, not enough Asian female authors.
I think I don't know what it is, honestly,
Huh.
but it was strange, right? That, you have a lot of people who are interested in themselves. So they talk about person stories, memoirs, journeys.
Hmm.
That is there. But if you look at Asian women collectively, there really wasn't any book that I came across. And that's when I said, okay, let me, take a dab at that and say if I can write a book on Asian women, because that's again my cultural lens, right, with which I can look at women. So that's where I came from. And, I do think that leadership is gender agnostic on one level.
Right.
But having said that, women are perceived differently in terms of their credibility, in terms of the way they communicate,
Hmm.
in terms of how they dress, even sometimes, and in terms of how,
Oh, I love
their
that.
performance. Yeah, in terms of their performance as well, right? So there are subtle nuances out there. And it almost seems like, you have an external layer, like a leadership layer, and then you have an inner layer, which is like a cultural layer, which is about mindsets and conditioning. And women have to navigate both, right? They have to do
Hmm.
all the stuff that leaders do, but you also have to navigate some of these inner layers of perceptions and, all of those things, and be great at your job. So it was interesting for me to look at that and see how Asian women navigated that and
Okay.
how did they succeed at the workplace. So that
So
was
they have
really where,
so
yes,
female
sorry.
leaders in Asia and elsewhere, actually, they have all the challenges that all the leaders have, but then they have one more level of challenge because they are female leaders.
I think so. Yes, in Asia, I think.
Mhm.
I mean, Asia, specifically, right? Because you have, harmony, you have patriarchy, you have humility, you have the need to please, you have the need not to confront, you have loss of face, you have all of these nuances which you're so familiar with, right? And yeah, so it's very interesting. It's very diverse. Yeah.
And it goes extremely deep. Because one of the things that intrigues me about this book is that male-female relationship goes far beyond business and leadership. It is one of the most fundamental, or let's call it gender relationship. But although we are here specifically talking about female leaders in environments which are mostly dominated by male leaders, but if we look at gender relationship, it's like obviously it manifests itself in the daily reality of, let's say, having a boss, but then it goes way beyond it. And one of the things of that came out of working in both Asia and Europe, because one of the things I do is I work for a big multinational company. I delivered a leadership or an intercultural program, can be coaching, can be training. And then the company says, this went well. Could you roll it out in a number of other countries as well? And then as I go from one country to another, one of the things that realizes not only the leadership style, the leadership traditions that differ from each other, but also how genders interact with each other, right?
That's
So
right.
and India is very interesting. You mentioned dress, for example. In Japan, in China, where I do a lot of my work, then male and female leaders don't dress so dramatically differently from each other. So in both
Yeah.
cases, they took over a kind of Anglo-Saxon way of dressing up for business. And then if you look at waist down, it could be different because female leaders wear more of a skirt, let's say, men wear trousers, but otherwise it's the same. And then when I started doing leaderships in India and women walk in their saris, especially if they want to dress up nicely, and then men either do or don't wear traditional costumes, it kind of emphasizes the difference. Now, this is
Hmm.
what leads me to my next question, because I will share a story with you from India, which resonated with me very deeply. But you will tell me how typical or untypical it is, because it was an intercultural leadership program, and gender just came up basically almost spontaneously. It was about young managers, and the next generation of managers in the company. And then they said, how many smart young women come out of university and enter their company? It's a multinational company. This was in Pune in India. And then they said, okay, we have to help them. We have to we have to give them promotions. We have to give them the resources to grow, development, and so on. And most of the participants were VPs, and most of them were men. So they are in front of the flip chart, and they are and one of them looks at me and says, yeah, but there is a big challenge here. So what if one of these young female leaders is very, very smart and gets promoted very fast, and then she becomes the boss of men? Then what do we do? And then to me, it was a very strange question. It didn't occur to me this could be a huge dilemma. But it was a breakout group, and then 4 other male leaders were looking at me like, yeah, what do you do then? Right. And what I want to ask you is, sometimes some of the interviews in your book seem to suggest that women are recommended to lean into it and use the specific female approach to business to become great leaders. But at other times, especially if you look at what your interview subjects say, it seems to be the opposite. And it seems to suggest that women are supposed to challenge the world of men in leadership by being tough, being detail-oriented, detail-oriented, maybe not such a good, tough, competitive. So almost like internalizing some of the winning tactics from a male-dominated leadership environment. So do you think this is relevant at all? How do you see the balance playing out?
Yeah. So, so it's really interesting because, when I started out, I just looked at it very openly, right, without having any preconceived notions. And I said, let's go along. But as I spoke to these women, and I spoke to about 50, 55 women across 6 Asian countries and men, I realized that one common theme of successful leadership, at least in that generation, 40s, 50s, was that these women were able to fit in, with the male worlds at their workplace, with organizations. At the same time, having built their cachet of credibility, they then were able to impact and influence and then become rock stars.
Okay.
So they were able to, it wasn't a fit in or stand out, which I would have thought, but it was very seamless. So it's like you go into a meeting and you say, okay, I'm reading the cultural code here and I'm saying, okay, what do I need to do here to be effective? And to get my work done. So I choose what tools I have at my disposal, and they get better as they go along. So it's almost a skill set, I felt, that was that was common to many of these women. On one hand, they could lean in, as you've just said, when needed. On another hand, they could sit back. They could be assertive when needed. They could be, humble or soft when needed. They could be vulnerable when needed. They could be courageous when needed. They could zoom in and look at the details, or they could zoom out and be strategic. As one lady in the Philippines said, they knew when to be in the balcony and when to be on the dance floor, So I felt that if I had to use the word balance, that's how I would use it. I wouldn't use it as a work-life thing. In fact, if you've noticed, I haven't mentioned that at all in the book, because I honestly don't think that concept doesn't really apply. And anyway, it's been done to death. But I think that that's where women do really well in Asia, is they are able to balance these seemingly contrary nuances, which are not easy to do. It's not easy. I mean, you can be one or the other, but how can you be both, and you choose the setting and you choose the context, right? But I think that's where they've been successful, because they've been able to read the cultural context, whether it's Thailand or Japan. And for example, this one lady in Japan said that, people tend to say that, oh, women talk a lot. So I got a coach. Okay. She works with an American bank. and she learned how to be extremely on point and succinct,
I
which is
remember her.
anyway a Japanese trait, right? Another leader in Thailand learned how to just speak up in meetings, you
Hmm.
know. In India, there was this leader who had worked in the US, and she was very, very on the ball, very assertive. And she was given advice as to how she has to temper her style and to be a little more soft and relationship focused, in order to be more effective in India. So you find that, and it's not just women, you find that men also have to adapt, right? But women certainly need to in
Hmm.
order to be effective.
And
So it was interesting. Yeah.
how do you think this relates to being authentic, being yourself? Because let's say we almost imagine like we are giving advice to female leaders, especially young female leaders, about how to build their leadership brand. So do you think that this kind of balancing act, and sometimes they have to learn how to speak to the point, sometimes they have to learn how to assert themselves, but sometimes they have to learn how to use a more feminine set of values of balancing and caring and using empathy. So do you think basically what you're saying is be yourself, be aware of who you are, and build it into a conscious leadership brand? Or depending on someone's personality and cultural background, can it be true that being yourself, being authentic doesn't help sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also applies when, as expats, right? When we have worked and lived in different places, sometimes if you're very confrontational or assertive or direct, it may not work in a more indirect setting. So it's not, if we forget about women for a moment, I think that applies to anybody who's working across cultures, right? And
Mm.
that's where we come in, as interculturalists, because we kind of explain that these are some values that may be important to consider. And we don't need to go from 0 to 10, but you can just be somewhere in the middle. And I think your book, Dragon Suit, also talks about that, right? In terms of how the more effective the effective expat manager in China is one who is more in the middle, right? I think that you have something like that, which I'm
Right.
not at either end of the spectrum, because then that's a hard sell, that's difficult to tweak, right? And that doesn't necessarily get you results. So I think it's a universal skill set that, applies. But
Hmm.
then when you talk about women, it certainly is something that can work very well. And I think they are authentic, and that's what was interesting. It's not like they were just doing it to check a box. So I'll give you another example. I have a chapter in the book on communicating tough decisions, right? Which is universally, women are labeled, right, in different ways when they communicate tough decisions. And there was this lady in India, Pavitra Singh, who is the CHRO of PepsiCo India. And I asked her, I said, how do you communicate tough decisions, in your HR role in New Delhi in that kind of a context? And she says that, look, sometimes I communicate indirectly, sometimes I communicate with humor, sometimes I communicate directly. But there is a line. And I always emphasize that I am not to be taken for granted, and there is a line which is important to respect. So, so she's authentic in that sense, right? She
Mm.
is, yeah. So she's saying that, hey, I'm saying it as it is. I'm being soft, I'm being nice because that's who I am. But at the same time, don't think I am a pushover, you know? So they're
That's a good
able to
one.
bring in, yeah, they're able to bring in that authenticity, and that is so admirable about this whole thing.
Right. It also depends. So now we are verging into assumptions, and this brings me to my next question, because there are huge differences between the countries that you take us in
Yes.
the book. So even if I just look at numerical statistical representation in these countries, so for example, just out of the countries where I do projects and I work with leaders, there is Japan, where both politics and business is heavily dominated by men. There is
Right.
China, where women are fairly represented in business, but almost absolutely not in politics. So there are very, very few um, uh, female, even members of parliament, not to mention high level political party leaders. And then on the other hand, maybe you can tell me about India, although India had at least one charismatic national leader who was female. And then there are those countries like Singapore or the Philippines that you mentioned, where women are very heavily represented both in business and politics and civil society. So these big differences make some of these assumptions more ridiculous than in some places than in others, right? The culture is different. The
Yeah,
gap between men. I just I just cannot not mention there was this really good story where I can't remember exactly which company it was, or maybe you didn't say the name of the company, but it was a very high level executive in a liquor company that one made alcoholic
yeah.
drinks. And then some
Diageo.
of the
Yeah.
male leaders, Diageo, was it? All right.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, to my home turf of whiskeys.
Yeah.
Then this female leader was asked if she even drinks alcohol, which of
Yes.
course in some of these Asian countries would be completely preposterous because women drink just as much as men. In some other countries, it would make sense. I mean, for example, in China, in certain cities, it would make sense. In yet some other countries, basically nobody drinks alcohol because it's a Muslim country and so on. So I don't know if it even makes sense to ask the question: in which of these countries is it the hardest to build a
Yeah.
leadership career as a woman? And in which of those countries is it relatively easy? Like in Europe, for example, in Eastern Europe, where I am right now, I'm talking to you from
Yeah.
Budapest, Hungary. It is somewhere in the middle, a little bit on the harder side. So a lot of female leaders complain. If you go to the north, if you go Sweden or Denmark, then the headwinds are much, much lower.
Yeah.
And then there is a huge variety all across Europe. So how about Asia?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great question. Okay, so I'll attempt to answer this. So I think based on the six countries, right, that I, cover, I think Philippines and Thailand are on one end of the spectrum. Yeah. They're very matriarchal almost. A lot of women in, everywhere in actually politics, not so much in Thailand, but in definitely at senior levels as entrepreneurs, etc. Right. And I mean, we had a Filipino helper, and when we were in Singapore, and it was almost okay for them to leave the house, have a child, and have that child being looked after by their by the grandparents, etc. Right? Whereas it's unthinkable in countries like India. So there aren't that many biases, so which makes it easier to have a career.
All right.
Other things being equal in the Philippines and Thailand. So I think those two countries are definitely, on one end of the spectrum in terms of progressiveness. On the other end is Japan. And I think
Uh-huh.
Korea is also very
You're not
close,
the
but I
first
can
one who
cover
says
Korea.
that.
No, it's not. And it's on, the research pans out,
Hmm.
So basically Japan is one of those places which is I read somewhere this great article in the New York Times where they said in Japan, um, men do work and women do housework, So that's a bit of the
Right.
mindset. Yeah.
Bit
And
sad for both sides, if you ask me.
yeah. So it's a bit complex in Japan. And I mean, Prime Minister Abe introduced Womenomics in 2012, but that hasn't really changed or moved the needle too much because in 2022, Japan was really, in the rankings of the World Economic Forum, it was the lowest
Right.
position as the G7 country. Yeah. So it hasn't really done well. Having said that, I do think that it's changing. A lot of these companies, even the big companies, are changing their policies, their ways of working, their promotion policies.
Mm.
And there are a lot of fantastic women leaders that I spoke to in Japan. Frankly, I can have a whole conversation on Japan itself because it really is a very
We
interesting
could.
dynamic, yeah. So I also spoke to some male leaders, so very interesting nuggets there. So, but I think Japan seems to be clearly a little bit less progressive
Hmm.
on that spectrum. Then you have places like China and Singapore where you have women at the workforce. But as you pointed out in your fantastic book, that in China, Mao said that yes, women hold up half the sky, but it is an unfulfilled ambition in your words, quote unquote. And I think that's true because on one hand they had the numbers then, but it's not always a level playing field, right? From what
Right.
I have seen. Yeah. So that's China and Singapore. And then you have India. Now, India is definitely a patriarchal country for the most part. You have places where, like as Abanti, my friend, mentioned about Diageo, where, and Abanti is a friend, and she's, highly educated, highly progressive, liberal, and she was asked this question and she was completely taken aback. Um, but she just plow down. So India is very diverse, so it's difficult to kind of put a pin on that. But you do have industries where it's very progressive and you have a lot of women. For example, banks, finance companies, media,
Mm.
journalism, advertising, plenty of women out there, very, very liberal. You will not be able to tell where you are, which part of the world, it's
Right.
that easy. Right. And then you have instances like the one you were talking about in Pune, which is, very few women, all, just a lot of men. So these could be, engineering
Very
companies.
industrial, lot of car
Yes,
companies, lot of machinery
yes,
companies there.
yes,
Maybe in
absolutely.
service, it's a
Like,
different picture.
yes. So, for example, my husband works with a pharmaceutical company, and he says that, the sales, when he was in Singapore, like there would be a lot of people, a lot of women in sales positions. In India, out of 5,000 people, you might have just 30 people, in
Mm.
sales, simply because of A, the logistical constraints, and B, you have all these other niggling issues that come up, right? Whether it's safety or other biases. So I think it depends on the industry, it depends on the
Right.
function, it depends on the city. And then, as you said, women politics, right? And that's an interesting dynamic because that's where hierarchy can actually be used effectively. Because Indira Gandhi was, a politician, but she was, she was aided, because of the fact that she comes from a political family, great lineage there, right? So it's the hierarchy. So I don't know if you've read uh, The Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen, but he talks about how in Indian society, class can trump gender. Okay,
Yes.
so
Yeah, I,
yeah,
I
so
have I have read some of his stuff, and he's very
yes,
argumentative, but
yes,
difficult to
yes,
refute. He's
difficult
also
to do.
also a data
Yes.
buff, right?
Yes. So if class can trump gender, and so then then what happens is if you're from a certain class of people, then you can go the distance,
Hmm.
and nothing's going to stop you, which is more
Right.
than what I can say for the US at this point of time. But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
But
you threw up a
yeah,
good ball with connecting East and West, because this was the last thing I wanted to ask you, is that as I as I went from one country to another and I work with people, then I always realized that cultural differences can also be a source of inspiration, because when you
yeah,
step into a culture, then some of the things that look the weirdest at the beginning also reveal something like a blind spot in another culture. And this is, for example, in India, especially after living for decades in China. When I work with Indian leaders, male and female, then what I discovered is that they are much more comfortable with the spiritual aspect of human relationships, and they were much more comfortable with when we talk a lot about role models, for example, in leadership programs. Where do your values come from? Where did you have somebody in your life who was a role model for a leader? They are very comfortable reaching back, and they are talking about an uncle who was a monk, or they talk about how their mother looked after the family. In China, people are not so comfortable with this aspect of life for many of the reasons that men-women equality is a sensitive political issue. Spirituality, religion, obviously a sensitive political issue. Another thing I realized is that, for example, majority Muslim societies, this is also something that in the West people have a tendency to be afraid of the gap, the cultural gap between men and women in these societies. But one of the things I learned is that the manifestation may be a little bit alien and difficult to get used to, but the root of it is this profound respect for gender differences. So basically, there is a distance because there is a protective space around female and male culture. Was there anything, or what was it, that you learned in some of these societies from some of these leaders, maybe some of these companies, that you think we could all benefit from, that we could all learn from? when men and women work together in leadership, because as much as we had a million years to figure this thing out, it's still going to be a topic for a while. What was
Yeah.
it that you said, you know, this one, the way they handle it, the way men and women work together in leadership positions, we could really replicate it. We could really learn from this.
Yeah, so I obviously didn't focus too much on the male part of it, but okay, so I think
Let me put
big
it in
picture,
differently. What could
yeah.
men learn from to work better with women based on your
Yeah.
interviews and your experience?
I think one would be to lead with vulnerability. Okay.
All right.
And yeah, so I
Okay.
find
You're
that
already pushing the envelope for men.
absolutely, because I think that's a big one, and I didn't see a lot of people doing it, and I think that goes to show how secure they are at the risk of being really frank.
Right.
Because and especially in hierarchical societies, alpha male leadership, you don't want to show that you don't know the answer. You don't want to show that how can you not know something, or how do you want to
Right.
say that you made a mistake, right? So it goes back to the cultural nuances, and I think it's really admirable when somebody says, "Hey, I don't know this. Can we just work together?" And that that happened a lot during COVID,
Mm,
and I think that's something that women now own that space. I think in terms of saying we don't know how this works, but let's try and collaborate and find the answers and connect the dots. And I think
mm,
that's what women do really, really well, and men can probably learn from that. I
mm.
think that's a
And
big
women
piece.
see through us anyway. I mean, even if we pretend we
Yeah.
don't have vulnerabilities, it
Yeah.
doesn't last
Yeah.
long if we work with a senior female leader.
Yeah. So I think
Right.
related to that is, having lesser egos, kind of, connecting with people at a different level, connecting the dots. I think these are some pieces that women do really well.
Mm,
And not all women again, but I think a lot of women, enough women. And I think that's something that men can take away. I think, something that I learned from the women that I interviewed was that they said that, it's all very well for men to open doors, in terms of giving us a position or entertaining us, things like that. But it's really not about, just opening a door. It's about walking that distance, right? In terms of if you see in a meeting, if you see a bias being expressed, do you step in and correct the bias, or do you just ignore it and say, okay, I don't know what happened here. I don't want to get into this. So,
okay.
I mean,
So,
that of
so you're
course,
encouraging or not encouraging?
no,
Are we
encouraging.
afraid of inaction or are we afraid of patronizing?
No, I think both. I think we
Mm,
want men to step in and correct the biases,
all right.
when they see them, in terms of, hey, that's not right. Why did you say this? We want men to come in and dig deeper a bit, and don't just go by the picture perfect image and the facade that is often presented in Asia, as you well know, right?
Mm,
So, it's like, oh, okay, everything is good. I'm fine. No, I mean, it's often gray, right? It's not black or
yes.
white, and it's gray.
Yes.
And I think, yeah, and when I talk to Western audiences, I feel like one thing that I think is important to take away is that if the what is important in the West, I think the how is important in Asia. You
Nice.
know, yeah, the how of how do you speak? How do you speak up? How do you impact? How do you influence? How do you dress? How do you express ambition? Because it's all very good to say, oh, I have ambition. But if you're brazen, if you're pushy, it may not be palatable, and it may actually
Right.
go against you, right? So the how is important. And, oftentimes I've seen Western leaders, and, again, at the risk of stereotyping, of course, people look at Asian leaders and say, oh, they don't have that fire. They don't have that spark. This is passive leadership. No, it's not. It just looks, it may be
I
very
see
assertive.
exactly.
Yes, it's assertive
Yeah.
leadership, but that's how it is in the Asian context. And you
Fantastic.
can't judge it from your prism and your lens. You need to look at it from how it is in Asia, right? So I think that's important, to kind of look beneath the lines, look between the lines, and to kind of redefine.
I love what you're saying. I'm jumping out of my seat because I had a project years ago when we localized for Asia the what do you call it? The assessment center. There's this kind of competency assessment center of a German company. And then one of the problems was there were many problems, starting with first name basis, which doesn't work in Asia. But one of the problems was that one of the KPIs by which they evaluated candidates for the next level of leadership was in role plays, whether they challenged the leader. And then
Oh, wow.
there were European HR leaders sitting in and observing the assessment center. And then if the Vietnamese or Korean or Japanese or Chinese candidates for the next level of position didn't challenge the person who played the senior leader, and they said, as you said, yes, this is not assertive leadership. This is not proactive leadership. And then when I localized the program, I just told them, listen, this is really, they do challenge each other. You just cannot see it because in Erin Meyer's culture map, it's the right side. It is not openly confrontational, but the meaning is still there. So thank you. There is so much to think about. And of course, if somebody decides to, from next week, to actually put this in action, it's still going to be a very hard struggle.
Absolutely. But at least it's the first step, right? I mean, you're thinking about it. Yeah.
No, you can work on this for a lifetime. Last question to you, very quick question, this thing that I call the tool tip. Okay. If somebody, let's say, wants to, apart from your book and apart from my book that we mentioned, and we will put the links in the show notes, do you have any resources that you would recommend to somebody who really wants to get, how do you say, bridge the gap between men and women in leadership, either just the gender or also if the added challenge is there because of East and West, Asia and the rest of the world? Anything from a website, another book, an article, an AI tool, even just a principle that you think helps a lot?
So, so I can't think offhand of a gender-related resource, but a book that I really like is Andy Molinsky's Global Dexterity. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yes. So that book is basically about, how you can adjust in a different cultural setting without losing yourself in the process. And I think it's so nice because it's not just applicable in a global setting or in a country setting, but also it could be in a team meeting, right? I mean, you could be the only person, the only woman or the only man or what have you, right? And it's like, how do you adapt without losing yourself? And we talked about this. We talked about authenticity. So I really like the book. I use it in almost all my workshops and communication programs that I run. So yeah, I think that's something that I would really recommend. Yeah.
Thank you. We will make sure in the show notes that they will find this book, anybody who is interested, and also that they find you. So we will share your LinkedIn profile, if that's okay. We will share the link to How Women Work. And then if you want maybe some of your other books as well, what else should we share? What are you up to these days?
Okay, so we can also share my website. Yeah, I'll send you the URL.
Sorry, it goes without saying, but I forgot.
No, that's okay. So I'm kind of looking at projects, meaningful projects along on these lines of diversity. So it could be cultural diversity, it could be gender diversity, it could be communication across cultures, it could be developing inclusiveness, it could be developing or enhancing cultural intelligence. So, a lot of different things, a lot of different themes. And I'm just happily doing things like this and happy to explore more things around this. And of course, talking around my two books and talking to people like you. Yeah.
Perfect. Aarti Kelshikar, it has been a delight talking to you. We haven't seen each other for such a long time, although I hope we will, because the conference where we met last time is going to take place in 2025 again. So maybe we can be speakers again. I will make sure that people find you and your book, and then we can continue the chat after I stop the recording. Thank you very much. Anything else that you would like to share with people who watched the video?
So, speaking of books, I really enjoyed Dragon Suit. I just finished reading it like yesterday, so it's very, fresh. And there were so many nuggets that I took away, not just in terms of China, but also in terms of expatriate management. I think I haven't seen a book like that, which really talks about selection of expatriates and, really covering that whole spectrum. So I thought it was very detailed and very interesting. And I will, write some notes and share them with you soon. So yeah, just it's a great read. I think a great resource for China. And I think there's so many things to learn, so many takeaways. Yeah. So thank you for writing it.
I will ask you about those notes. But
Yeah.
for now, I will thank everybody who has been watching me. Thank you very much. Stay with us, check the show notes, and I look forward to seeing you again when there is another video. So as I always say, find me online and drop me a line. Thank you, Aarti. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Gabor. Absolute pleasure. Yeah.